Thanks very much. Thanks. And we're going to just jump in today, look at mastering automated testing. So I'm Grant Archwood. I'm a program manager in the PowerCat customer advisory team. And we're going to just go through looking at how testing can work inside the Power Platform. It's something that's kind of important to us. Like, I manage one of the things, the COE Starter Kit, which is a low-code framework that we give to our customers to enable them to go test and automate the platform. And so one of the things we're trying to do in this is, how do we take this product that's like 4 years old and manage it over time? We've got multiple teams that have managed this over time. It's built out of Power Apps, it's built out of Power Automate, it's built out of Dataverse, we've got Power BI in there, and the product is changing all the time. So one of the things that we've got to do is improve our software engineering in terms of how we manage this project itself. So everything I'm kind of showing in the session today is something that we're actively using as a customer advisory team to improve what we do with the low-code solutions we build. So let me jump in, and I'm just going to have a look at, firstly, why automated testing? In terms of it's an existing practice we've had for decades in the software industry, and how do we bring some of those concepts across into low-code Power Platform? And I'm going to just guide you through what are some of the things you can do and give you some demos of what you can do today in the Power Platform in terms of testing. But as I start out, I just want to start out with a bit of a kind of a software archaeology of like, where have we come from? So if you're going to kind of look back historically, a lot of things we started with manual and ad hoc testing, physical machines. And as we developed over time, we got software teams together, we built roles specifically around testing. And as we got into the 90s, we started to get to a point where you could start automatically recording interactions with an application. You could start off an app, you could enter some text, click through an application. And we progressively added more and more to this to make it easier. So you could start scripting that interface. You could look at how you go apply that to a website, put frameworks there to make testing much easier. And if you're going to look at where the industry is today, we're looking at how we would put generative AI on top of that. How would you generate synthetic data? How would you automatically generate your tests to make this process easier? And if you're going to look at the Power Platform, we're on this large software arc ourselves. Like, how do you take all these practices of what we've done before and apply them to low code? So if you're already applying testing today, how do you integrate your testing approach into the Power Platform? And if you're new to this, how do we use some things like generative AI? How do we use some of the low code scripting approaches we have with Power Effects to make this easier? So let's dive in, let's have a look at how this works for us. So first thing I want to start off is, what are some of the software challenges? If you're going to look at the range of the Power Platform, there's so much we can do with it. So if on the left-hand side of it, we may be doing things that are more personal productivity, something that just applies to you. You may be just bringing in something that triages an email coming in. And maybe you don't want to apply software testing because maybe it's just something that you're doing for your system. Then the other side of it is like, okay, maybe it's something that's impacting a larger amount of your organization. It's something that's critical to the way that you're working, and you might want to apply more automated tests for that solution. So that spectrum of working out what's the range of things is probably something you're going to want to think about at that first part of testing. The second one is going to be, okay, how should I test it? Should I be testing things in isolation? How can I be bringing pieces together to test them together? Or am I trying to do end-to-end tests to go validate how that whole business process works? And then finally, like, how are we going to support this? How are you going to make sure that you're successful doing this great idea? And maybe you want to migrate this to someone else to take over. Maybe you want to migrate this to a support team. How do you build a sustainability model in so that your great idea can continue to live year on year on year? So that's kind of the frame we're going to think about, is in terms of, we're going to go through some of the things we can do with automated testing for things that have greater impact, look at some of the ways you can do like unit testing and integration testing, and how that can go into a DevOps process where you can have a continuous integration deployment process to support that. Okay, so let's have a look at specifically how we apply automated testing in the Power Platform. And overall, what we kind of think about it in 5 main stages. We kind of think about, okay, first off, Leon demonstrated in the keynote today the whole plan process. We're using the plan designer to say, I want to take a bit of text. I want to take some input, some process, and I want to go build out, these are the personas you want to go build for, these are the key components that you want to build. And out of that, you may get some technology elements that drop out. So you might want to build a Power App, a Power Automate flow, you might want to build a Copilot, you may want to go add your data model behind that and extend it. So as you're running through that process, how could you build tests as part of that process? And today we'll just talk through some of the things we're doing around Test Engine, which is a framework that started from Power Apps, and look at how that's going to eventually grow across other parts of the Power Platform. And then once you've done that initial process of building your great idea, how do you integrate that as part of your build deployment process where you can take pipelines? How do you extend pipelines out so you can actually make sure that as you go from development to test to production, that you can make sure that the solution you're building is doing what it's intended? And then finally, from a monitor and improve side, is like, as the framework changes, how do you continually update it, make sure the solution's working? As the framework changes, how do you make sure that it continues to work as expected? So that's the overall kind of frame we're going to do. We're going to step through, this is showing a local test. We'll show how you then can go run through that process, how do you go through the learning curve of understanding it, and then how do we get to the end of the process of including that in a build process. So there's three main things we've got to think about in terms of that spectrum of choices you could have. You can start on the left-hand side with a unit test. And these principles are, if you're a pro dev today, these are very common decisions you're going to make off the trade-offs between, am I going to start building something in isolation? I just want to go test it independent of any dependencies it has. Am I trying to join multiple components together and check how they work together? Or maybe I'm trying to check an overall end-to-end business process. And if I look at that specifically for the Power Platform, to give you an example, I might have a Power App today, I may have a Canvas app, or a model-driven application. I might want to test it in isolation. I might want to say, what happens if I mock how Dataverse works? What happens if I make a call to a connector and I want to go look at how the application responds when I give it different types of data? Or maybe I want to do an integration test. So I want to take a Power App and a Power Automate and Dataverse and bring it together and say, how does that process work when I combine those components together? Or maybe I want to create a health check to say, how do I make sure this application works if you've got a privileged user? What happens if you've got a non-licensed user? How do we just validate what the behavior of this application works with these different personas? Or maybe you want to go do that kind of end-to-end test where maybe you're dropping a file into SharePoint, you've got a Power Automate flow, maybe there's a conversational agent on that, and you want to model that whole process. What I'd say generally though, it tends to be the ones that end-to-end test generally are kind of slower and take longer to do, whereas those unit tests are quicker, faster, they give me a quicker feedback loop. So it's always going to be a balance to work out what do you want to do as a unit test, what do you want to do together to bring it as an integration test, and what do you want to do as a full end-to-end test, but realizing that's going to take a longer time. So what I want to do is like, okay, so how do you do this? So what can we do? What are some of the tools that we've got available to help us work through this process? So one of the areas that we've been working on is Test Engine. So Test Engine is an open source solution that we've got that enables you to go test initially Power Apps. So testing your Canvas apps, your model-driven applications, but it does have an extensibility framework built in so you can support multiple providers, and it has an extensibility model to go handle different components of the system. So I'm going to just step through the 4 parts of this in terms of what this looks like. Whether or not you're running it from the open source version where you're building it from source code, which I'll show today, or we're going to be updating the Power Platform command line interface where you can integrate it and just run the tests as part of your build process. So the first is authentication. So when you're starting with an application, one of the key things is you want to think about how do you do it from a secure, compliant point of view? How do you handle multi-factor authentication? And one of the things we have worked on is making it much easier to go through that initial process of signing on, securely storing tokens and enabling those tokens to be used for different user personas. The second one is we've started with Power Apps, but we also have a roadmap to add Microsoft Copilot Studio and Dataverse as other first-party providers that you can go create tests for. The third one is kind of Power Effects. So it's at the heart of what we're doing at Test Engine. So it enables you to model all the different tests you've got as low-code Power Effects steps and abstract out the complexity, whether or not that is sitting on top of Playwright to go automate a web page, or maybe it's talking directly to the Copilot engine, or maybe it's talking straight to the Dataverse SDK. So Power Effects gives you that abstraction layer to look at how you go interact with it. It also makes it easier for us to do that kind of record and replay approach where we can watch what occurs and transfer kind of what's occurring from a network point of view, your actions you're taking, and automatically generate the Power Effects to give you a starting point to go build your test cases. And finally, it enables us to look at how you take natural language, and we've had investment over years to say, how do you take natural language and generate the Power Effects? And transferring that knowledge to go help you go build generative tests. And the last one is just looking at it from a pipeline point of view is, it's all good to go build a test locally, but how do you then go build that into a pipeline that can automatically run all the time through the overall process? So let's have a quick look at what that pipeline process looks like. So I'm going to start here. I'm going to run through in a moment, just going through what is the process of learning, running a local copy of Visual Studio Code, where I'm going to go run a test for a model-driven application. Once I've got that done, I could go commit that to a location. So maybe that could be Dataverse, it could be your source control system. And you're going to have a deployment solution that goes along with your solution you're trying to deploy. And you can extend that out so you can actually hook into that process, say, when I go from development to test, I want to make sure that I run all my automated tests and validate that it works. And then when I go from test to production, I want to add another hook to say, did all my tests work successfully? And I might want to have a manager approval before I move on to the next stage. So the idea is to go better model what's the business process you want to go say, here's my safe place to build. I want to go take it, test it. I want to validate that it works, verify automatically that it works. And then I want to go take that to production and verify that it's working in production and have a gated kind of approval process before I get there. So before I jump into the details and just show you that, I just want to kind of give an overview of kind of what's the current state of where we are today and where are we kind of going around testing, thinking about Test Engine. So the first thing we've kind of started with, as I mentioned, is we started with Power Apps. We've got an update coming out soon that's going to update how you can do Canvas applications and work with model-driven applications. That process is still work in progress, and we will continue to refine how model-driven applications work in terms of Power Apps. We're starting off looking at experimental providers for Microsoft Copilot Studio and Dataverse. So we can take the same concepts in terms of how you create low-code tests for Power Apps and transfer those same knowledge across to build Copilot Studio tests and Dataverse tests. You can integrate today with Power Automate, called from a Power App. But some things we're looking at in the future is how would you enable you to do logical tests of the flow that your Power Automate goes in terms of mocking how it's triggered, the actions you get as you run through a Power Automate flow. Okay, so hopefully that gives you enough context to jump into. So what I'm going to just go through is 3 different scenarios. So one of the first things is just to look at how we deal with the learning path. Second one is just what does it look like to go run a Power Automate test today, a Power Apps test today? And thirdly, I'm going to just go through what does that look like from a DevOps point of view. I'm going to do that with kind of three myths, and I'm just kind of building on what kind of Leon did at the start of the keynote, and just look at this from a testing point of view. So the first myth is like, automated testing is too complex, and it requires specialized skills. Like, how do we help with that? So one of the things we've done is we've tried to think about, okay, how do we make the process of learning how to build tests easier and more engaging? So we've created this learning playground to help you through the learning process. So I'm going to step out of my presentation, and we'll just go open up the learning playground. So this is the learning playground. So this is the GitHub page that we have for the Power Apps test engine. And it starts off here where I've got just a simple expression where I've got a block here where I can say, okay, I just want to go test, well, what is 1 and 1 equals 1? Just very basic things. So as we build up a test, one of the key things we want to start with is, okay, just logical expressions. It's the key to go building up, how do I verify something's working? And I can just go hit try it in this window here. And when I do try it, it actually just evaluates the power effects behind this. So if I can go put 1 equals 2, obviously that's going to be false. And then I can say, okay, well, if I'm new to power effects, there's some different ways slightly how, if it's more like Excel, that it goes and looks at Boolean expressions. So I can go take an AND condition here and say, okay, what does an AND look like and how does it work? And then come down again and I can say, yep, that's true, it's working as expected. And I can say, okay, now I'll go make this false and you'll see it work. So the idea is to say, okay, let's start with a very small idea, master that concept within a few moments. And then say, okay, now I've learnt that skill, now it's come across and understand how collections work. So there's already a pre-populated accounts collection here. And in this accounts collection, it's automatically created an account and a name. I can start interacting with that directly inside the browser. So I can say, okay, I'd like to deal with the first account and I'd like to get the name of that and just validate that that works. And so try it. Okay, I understand generally how that is. And you can then run through the series of steps to say, how do you go deal with counting rows, getting items? Once you've got that kind of concept mastered, you can say, okay, now I want to start putting some of these things together. I want to just take the concept of an assert, which is a very common pattern from a software development point of view, and say, okay, how would I apply that to Power Platform? So I could go say, I want to take this label, which has got heading, and I want to assert that that heading equals the expected value. And then as I go through that and I go, obviously that's true, it's going to come out there. And if I go change heading to be a different value, it's going to come back and go, okay, it's now throw an error because that value, that logical expression I created is not true. And then we can combine some of these concepts together to create some more interesting kind of scenarios. So if we could take that from a simulation point of view, I can say, okay, I want to go take a call to a weather service. So if I call this weather service and I clear this off and go try it, it's going to return the data for, here's Seattle and here's the temperature in Seattle. And if I want to then say, rather than getting the data for Seattle using this mock connector, I want to go simulate it. So every time I call the weather service, I just want it to be other and cold. And then I can go assert that it's other and cold. And that way I'm kind of getting independence from actually having the connector. So I can build it in a way that I don't have to worry about the actual real connector being there or the real database being there. I can just go check the behavior of my application in terms of how it reacts to that. So the idea is you can go follow these things through here, and you can even get it to more complicated scenarios where I can go deal with things like, how do I deal with localization? So if I want to go change this to French, I change it to the French locale, and I can then go add in an expression saying, how does this work in the French locale using the language function, and does it return the correct, based on the time and date of the time and date, what you'd like to have a response. So that's, in that example, we just went through basically, how do you go through that learning path? How do you make it easier to get started so that you're not kind of going through that learning curve? So that's the key things we're going to go out of that is like, use the playground. The playground will help you learn the key concepts of how you apply testing and some of the key concepts. Incrementally build up those skills, and Power Effects can help you abstract out some of the key complexity. So the next one we're going to go through is Power Platform testing can only be done manually. So the example I'm going to do here is I'm going to pick a Power App, and I'm just going to show how that works, and it's going to open up an abstraction on top of Playwright. So that's going to be my second demo that we're going to have a look at. So I'll escape out of this, come back here, and we'll get out of PowerPoint again. Okay, and this time here, we're just gonna open up Visual Studio Code. I've got a weather sample here, and I'm just gonna hit run tests on this. So this is gonna go connect to my environment, and it's going to, I've already authenticated to this environment. I've got my credentials set up for it, and I've already authenticated to the environment. So it's got my credentials. It's already done multi-factor authentication already. I'm doing a build from source strategy. So this is taking the source code that we've got in GitHub, it's compiling it locally. And the idea of this version here, if you want to work from source, you get the latest version of all the features. If you want to use our pack CLI version, it's already pre-packaged and ready to go. So it's making sure that all the components are there, that it's got Playwright, it's got all the browsers installed. And once those checks are done, it'll be ready to go. We'll hit a button, we'll then start the test, and it's going to start up Playwright. So it's ready to start. I don't want to attach the debugger in this case. I'm just going to continue on. So in this case here, it's now going to open up Playwright. And I'm not having to worry about the mechanics of actually how I opened up Playwright. That's already done by the framework itself. So it's going to start Playwright up. It's going to have a look at the credentials that I've already entered. It's going to go directly to this model-driven application. And it's going to go run this weather sample using the same concepts that I was using in my learning playground. It's looking at the connector, go to MSN Weather, and it's coming in there and it's saying, rather than actually going off to the real MSN Weather connector, it's going to use the mock data that I've set up inside my test. And it's going to say, okay, how does my thing work with a test location? What happens if it's sunny or cold? What happens when I set my category? And it's automatically run all those tests. So that way, this is a demonstration of how we've simulated a dataverse with some sample data. We've tested the interface of how the application works, and I could go take this Power Effects with different settings for different languages. I can go commit that to my source control system and have that run as part of my build. So that's going to be our third demo we're going to go have a look at. So our third demo is, what does this look like from an ALM process? How do we go run this? So what we're going to do is, and rather than go back to PowerPoint just showing you with the third demo, I'm just going to show you, okay, jump into that third sample. So in this third sample here, I've got two solutions that are sitting inside my environment. One is a deployment solution. So this deployment solution is there to help me with adding extensibility hooks into my deployment process. Particularly in this deployment process, I want to go, so when I deploy from my development environment to my test environment, I want to go run some tests. So this middle tab here is my application that I was just showing here. So this is my model-driven application. And I want to test this application works from a build pipeline point of view. I would go in here, I would go to pipelines, I would say deploy here. And we saw this demoed early in the day, so I won't go through the part of just deploying here. But the key part of that process is in this deployment part here, we've got this test validation. I'm just going to open up and look at that Cloudflow. So what this Cloudflow is doing is when you install a hosted version of pipelines into an environment, you can go set it up so that you can say, there's a database action that gets called. And you can call it at different parts of the process. So the particular action I'm picking for this sample is saying, when a deployment is completed, so when we deployed from dev to test, I want this to trigger. And what I want to do is I want to go queue a new build to my build pipeline. So I'm just using the connector for Azure DevOps to go queue a new pipeline. I could pass parameters through to that. Alternatively, if it's Azure DevOps or GitHub, I could just go choose the appropriate connector there. If I choose another build system, I could alternatively just use a different connector or a custom connector to go connect to those systems. And that's all I would need to do to kick off the build. And then on the other side of it, then it's going to be a standard build process. We're just going to come through and we're going to go see a standard build process. We're running the command line interface, and we're still seeing those test engine will automatically create the test results files and include it. So if you're coming at this from a code first developer, you don't have to worry that this was created in PowerFX. It just looks like a test result alongside it, like everything else you build. If you're coming at this from a low code, all this kind of complexity of how the pipeline works is kind of abstracted away, and you just integrate it with it using this Cloudflow here to go integrate with this process. So overall, what that's showing is it enables you to kind of, how do you easily trigger a process using the extensibility hooks that are there and still take advantage of having pipelines behind the scenes. And in my pipelines here, I could go back to my pack pipeline and I would see here's all the builds that have occurred. And I could go through and say, what were all the steps and how did it run as part of that process? Okay, so I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk through where can we go from here in terms of hopefully that's kind of showing you three things. You can kind of extend your test. So we started here with Power Apps, but as we go through this, we're going to take the same language and approach to be able to go extend to other parts of Copilot Studio, Dataverse, or Power Automate. We went through that demo. We're saying, okay, integrating with Azure DevOps is hard, and it doesn't have to be. You can just go integrate using Cloud Flows to go call off to whatever your build process is. And we went through that demo in terms of what that would look like. And we're going to be following up in terms of having articles showing you how to go configure this for your own systems. So overall, what we did is we went through this process of looking at, okay, you start on your own machine, you can extend the platform to go add in rules that you want to go integrate with Azure DevOps. You could do the same kind of rules when you go to production to plug into the process to maybe have a Power Automate Cloudflow kick up and ask for an approval before it goes in. You've got control to say, how do you control it, configure it? You can integrate your tests as part of that process to make sure there's a quality loop inside that. So the last few things I just want to kind of quickly cover is, where are we going with this? So overall, what you're going to see is going to be graded coverage. Like while today we've focused a lot on Power Apps, look at other providers that we can plug into this process. And don't just think about web-based tests. We could go take other NuGet packages, command line interfaces, work with like the Director Engine to work with Copilot Studio, working with the Dataverse API to go integrate with that. And the idea is to go, how do we enable us to have greater amount of AI in there to say, as we've got different parts of AI in the product, how do you go validate that? So if I've got an AI-based summary that turns up in an app, how do you validate that? When you show form fill, how do you go validate that it's getting the right information into the form? How do you go check the multiple stages of a conversation are grounded with your organization? There's going to be some follow-up links in. So what I showed you is that Power Apps test engine site where I had the playground at the start. There's a lot of documentation there from a business point of view, from a technical point of view as part of this process. There's that learning playground that will help you through that process. And we're going to be working on technical learning modules to help you through the learning path. The idea really is, give us feedback on what works. What would you like to see? What additional things would you like in the learning playground to help you through that path so you can get the adoption quicker? The last thing I kind of want to just leave you with is, what are some of the ideas as you're hacking? Think about from a quality point of view, what else could you do to, as you're building this idea, to show how would you extend automated testing to what you're doing? How would you turn something that's a blocker into something that's automated to verify whatever you're building continues to work and can be automated? How would you make it a more supportable process and sustainable process? Are there any other ideas or hacks that you've got that, as an open source project, you could work with us to kind of contribute? So those are my kind of key things I'd say there. Have a look at how this is done. There's lots of video content there. We're going to look at adding. There's lots of material that we've got there, and look forward to seeing what you hack, and back to you.